The steps of boots on tarmac gently echoed back from the large buildings after the group had left the public conference. The bright ball that was the planet star was hanging low now, almost dipping behind the surrounding buildings, while giving the usually almost cyan sky an actual blue colour for once, as it gradually darkened with the dimming light. Luckily, the streets were pretty empty at this time. The after-work rush for early shifts had just passed, and later shifts were now right in the middle of their day, meaning only those without any responsibilities and those who had to travel for their work were out and about now. Sheeda was walking next to James absent-mindedly, occasionally glancing over at him to check if he still had that sour expression on his face that hadn't left his features ever since his earlier exchange with the galaxy's finest. It was odd to see him being this lastingly bothered about someone making him what could only be described as a not well thought out offer. He had been openly threatened or ridiculed, and seemed less pissed about that. She pressed her lips together slightly as she pulled them around while trying her best to understand, but she just couldn't quite relate this time. Of course, she understood his reasoning behind not taking the offer. He was right. It would most likely lead to disaster one way or another, but she still couldn't quite help but feel that he may have overreacted to the whole thing just a bit. She was somewhat shaken out of her pondering as something dark suddenly pushed itself into the corner of her vision, giving her a bit of a start at first, before her eyes shot around and realized it was just the hand of one of the people walking behind them, reaching out and placing itself on James's shoulder. With the blackness of the gloves and uniform it was covered by, the arm had almost appeared like a slithering shadow for a moment there. Or maybe she was just a bit on edge. The sour look on James's face vanished for a moment as he turned his head to look at the source of the sudden contact, though it was clear that the underlying feelings were still there. They just weren't taking up enough of his focus to read on his face anymore. "You feeling any better?" Admir asked, his hand closing around James's shoulder a bit firmer so that the black uniform crinkled underneath his grasp. Sheena was surprised at the amount of concern that came along with the question, hiding just underneath a deliberately casual tone. Admir wasn't just anybody. He knew James well, and not just a little. So if he sounded so concerned, there had to be a reason for it. Sheena glanced back up at James's face, while she and Admir now both waited for an answer. He had put on a bit of a smile for now, a friendly, polite one that didn't manage to quite reach his eyes. Of course, she knew that, had he not been addressed, he would likely still be scowling to himself quietly. However, she wasn't sure if that was all too concerning of a behaviour. Was Admir just overreacting? Or was she missing something here? Something that maybe hadn't come up before between her and James. "I'm good. Just a bit drained," James replied with a mild chuckle that didn't really come from actual humour, but was more meant to calm those listening. But man, they just really managed to piss me off. Admir chuckled as well, sounding just a bit relieved by that answer. "Really? I couldn't tell," he gave back teasingly, before his grip shifted into a few light pats onto James's shoulder. Then he pulled his arm back. "Can't wait until you get to be one-on-one with him." "Oh, don't remind me," James grumbled under his breath, and pulled his eyes away from Admir to watch where he was going once again, though in the movement he also got a roll of his eyes in there. "At least I guess I'll actually get to really go off on him when we're supposed to be seriously discussing things." That sentence seemed to capture the attention of someone walking on James's other side, and Sheeta could see Nia turn her head slightly as she glanced over at her brother with some hesitancy. "Go off on him even more?" she asked, sounding slightly concerned about that prospect. James chuckled again, seeming to read his sister's mind as he found a way deeper meaning to that question than what was actually asked. Bringing his mechanical right hand up over his chest, he crossed his heart for a moment. "I promise I won't be throwing any hands with the geriatric," he swore as he performed the gesture, then letting his hands hang down again. "He may not be the best at thinking, but I highly doubt he's going to say something stupid enough to really make me lose my temper. I've got a pretty good handle on it these days." Nia took a deep breath and released it with a heavily suppressed groan. "Yeah, I know," she said, and shook her head gently. But then she snickered, ever so slightly, as she added, "Guess that's just old trauma talking." As they were chatting, the point men of their little formations had already moved on to the next corner they would have to turn. Guided by either pure coincidence or a weird shift of fate, Sheeta took a quick glance in their direction, just in time to see Andrej and Coco move around the corner for only a second, before the one was suddenly stopped by the other, stretching out an arm and blocking his way. Andrej bumped against the arm, but was pushed back with surprising strength, as Coco stopped in her tracks first, and then quickly pulled him back around the corner, despite the surprised glance Andrej threw down at her. Led by a gut instinct, or maybe her training paying off, Sheeta immediately followed her superior's lead, and reached out to stop James as well, before he would distractedly run into the two that were now taking cover, just behind the end of the wall of the building they had been walking next to for a bit now. Just like Andrej before him, James ran into Sheeta's arm and glanced down at her in confused surprise. However, Sheeta was now entirely focused on what was happening in front of her, her eyes fixating on Coco, while her ears turned to not miss a single word that was exchanged, even if it was whispered. "Open window," Coco was currently whisper-hissing at Andrej, to give him a quick update on why she had so suddenly stopped their journey. By now, everyone was beginning to slowly stack up, as the back end of the formation was catching up with the now stopped front half. "Open window?" Andrej asked, and moved closer to the corner again once Coco had pulled her arm back, and given him free range to do so once more. "We are that careful now." "We are if they're right next to a running AC," Coco informed back, as she pressed herself to the wall for a moment while reaching for a weapon. "Those are rare enough as is around here. The systems all have that obnoxious blue light when you activate them, so it's kind of noticeable." Sheeta blinked at that information. Admittedly, she hadn't noticed that. Quite possibly because the AC in her and James's shared room had not been activated a single time. A quick glance over at James, which was basically the only face she could see right now, indicated that he also hadn't really paid attention to that detail before. "Maybe they just need to air out some stench, but I don't know if she should risk it." Coco finished her assessment, while Andrej had reached the corner and glanced around. He paused for a moment, as he seemingly studied what he saw. "Which window was supposed to be open?" he asked quietly, and glanced back at Coco, causing the commander to quickly hurry back to the corner as well, to see for herself. "Damn!" she let out a frustrated hiss. "Either the stench is gone, or they noticed our odd behavior. I should have acted more natural." "Better safe than sorry," Sam butted into the conversation, slowly moving up to the two commanding officers huddled right at the corner. "Are we diverting?" Both the commander and the major seemed to be pondering that for a moment, obviously not wanting to make any hasty decisions. Given that she was technically the second highest rank around, Sheeta also began to think, wanting to add any good ideas that she may be able to come up with. Her heart was beating slightly faster now, and she could hear the blood rushing for her ears. Just like Coco had said, this may have been nothing, or it may have been serious, and as long as they weren't sure, it was better to treat it like it was life and death. Next to her, she noticed a movement as Nia was moving up to James. With Tia immediately busying herself with guarding their flank, once they had stopped moving, it seemed like she was now searching for comfort with her brother, as things seemingly got serious around her. James reassuringly put his arm around her shoulder and whispered quietly in a language Sheeta didn't understand, likely trying to encourage his sister. Now concerned for the other civilian in their group, Sheeta turned her head to search for more, finding a sight that she hadn't expected. As Konglorch placed one of his large hands on the Raphaelite's arm in a gentle hold, while his head turned and most his eyes shot around, individually scanning the surroundings, although one at a time, seemed to always remain with the old lady as well. "Even if whoever that was left, we don't want to run into them while they are trying to get out. Who knows what happens if we accidentally corner them?" Coco loudly finalized the decision they had reached, while Sheeta was distracted, and the feline quietly bit her lip to admonish herself for not being more active here. "We're going to go back along this building until we find a bit of cover. Then we'll rent transport back to the hotel. Everyone stick to your positions. Jamie, keep your head down." Everyone quietly confirmed and took a moment to spread back out into their previous formation before following the proposed plan, moving back along their building cover, just with their weapons drawn now. Since their directions were reversed now, Sam, Abir and Tuya had lead this time, while Coco, Andrej and technically Shida formed the anchor of the group. Eventually they reached a small sort of entrance area that would lead into what was most likely an apartment building, which luckily allowed access from only one direction, the direct other side of the road, which they could fairly easily keep an eye on. Nobody really said much after Coco had put in the call for cabs to come pick them up. Everyone simply seemed to focus on either not missing any possible movement on the other side of the road, or on making sure that they had not missed any possible angles of attack from some other direction. Though as she stared at the rows of windows in front of her, Shida had a weird moment of clarity in which she realized how ridiculous this would have been to feel. All this fuss about a window that was open while an AC was running, and then not open anymore when they looked again. It should have been absolutely nothing. It most likely was nothing. Yet somehow it felt justified. And somehow, that was even scarier to her than the idea that there could have really been an ambush plan for them. She was also still impressed that Coco had even managed to spot the oddity, and identified it as sufficiently odd to react to it within mere heartbeats. Then again, even if one didn't necessarily expect it by her general behaviour, she was basically the most experienced out of all of them. Only even rivaled by Andrej. Well, and obviously Konglorj, though that probably didn't count. Then again, the fact that the Lizardor didn't even have a snide remark to make about the fact that they were basically running away from a mere opened window made things seem even more serious. James was still whispering to Nia while they waited, and Morris sat down next to the two of them, both to also offer reassurance, and to also be reassured by the gentle tones, by the looks of things. Thankfully, it didn't take too long until their transport arrived, and with the streets as empty as they currently were, they barely had to stop on their way back to the hotel. Coco and Andrej got out of the cars first, quickly taking a look around and scanning the surrounding area, before then quickly ushering the rest out of the cars, hurrying into the hotel. Things kind of happened in a whirl for a moment, before they were finally back in their rooms, pulling the curtains shut and turning the light down low. "Keep the windows covered and stay out of any direct lines from them as much as possible," Coco ordered her and James with a raised finger, putting on her commanding voice that didn't leave a hint of her usual playfulness behind. "And don't open the door for anyone who doesn't know the sign." With her breath filter removed now, the commander had a steely expression on her face that hardened her features so much that she was barely recognizable. Her green eyes had turned into marbles of cold glass, and her thick eyebrows were furrowed slightly as she stared into both of their eyes, almost as if she needed to get the message across to children. Obviously, James and Shida both knew how to behave already, and had no interest in making their protection any harder than it had to be. Still, Coco's entirely unusual behaviour nevertheless convinced them to give a quick, saluting answer to the positive, as if the orders had been necessary and appreciated. Coco nodded, and made her way to the room's exit, though as she was about to leave, she glanced back with a worried expression one more time. "Try to rest a bit," she said, her tone now a good bit softer than before. Her expression also somewhat turned back into the woman Shida knew when it softened just a bit, a slight sheen returning to her eyes. "I'm going to do my best to coordinate with local law enforcement. Let's hope they take this seriously." With that, she slipped out of the door completely, closing it behind her. "Just what we needed," James grumbled under his breath, before releasing an almost exasperated sigh. Now that he no longer needed to comfort his sister, it seemed that, while he was very much still stressed by the situation, it was a lot more grueling for him than truly frightening, at least while he was cooped up in this relatively safe room. Luckily for them, their bed didn't really allow any direct lines to be drawn from it to their window, meaning that lying down would likely be mostly secure. "At least they gave up easily for now," Shida said, trying her best to say something encouraging. She had been, well, not really stunned by this all. She had participated, after all, and she had been attentive. Still, she also hadn't really been as completely there as she would have wanted to. And the worst part of it? She didn't even understand why. Usually she was pretty good under pressure, but somehow she had just completely lost her groove recently, it seemed. Yeah, James concurred with her earlier statement, though a sigh he released right after indicated that it was little more than the barest consolation. Then, keeping away from the window as much as possible, he moved over to the bed. Well, maybe Coco was right. Maybe we should rest. She'd nodded and joined him. Not long after, they were laying next to each other. James's warm, organic arm wrapped around her as he gently pushed up against her back. Her ears twitched slightly as his breath brushed past them, tickling her slightly. Still, somehow, she felt restless. Her tail swayed slightly underneath the blanket, and one of her fingers gently tapped at the mattress as she suppressed the urge to drive her claw into it. "Hey, James?" she eventually asked into the dark room, as she began to realize she probably wouldn't be falling asleep like this anytime soon. He wasn't afraid of waking him up because she could tell that he was still awake by his breathing and heartbeat. Still, it took him a moment before he answered. "Yes, treasure?" She'd tilted her head a bit, so she looked down at the mattress before she spoke up again. "Do you maybe want to talk about what happened today?" she wondered aloud, feeling that she still had many questions about what exactly had been going on between him and Afyuna. She still didn't get why he had been behaving so strangely back there. The answer she got was once again a long moment of silence, before his deep voice finally came from the darkness, right behind her ears once again. "I really don't want to be that guy, but could we maybe leave that for tomorrow?" he said carefully, sounding pretty drained all of a sudden. Though, despite the suddenness, it didn't sound like he was putting it on. "I swear I won't avoid the topic. I'm just..." "It's all right," Sheeta interrupted him, and slid one of her hands down a bit to take his and squeeze it firmly, before he could start explaining himself. He really didn't have to. Sometimes you just needed to rest. Sheeta knew that better than most. Just don't forget, okay? James released a strong exhale through his nose that gently tickled past Sheeta's ears, before returning her squeeze of his hand in kind. "Promise," he said. Then he nuzzled against her a bit tighter, the pressure of his arm around her increasing, pressing her back more firmly against him. And she didn't know if it was just the promise that things would be cleared up when she woke up again, or if it was just this slight increase in physical comfort. But suddenly, the sleepiness did finally manage to catch up to her, as she drifted off faster than she even knew herself. Though her dreams weren't really taking form that night. They were nothing but shadows and schemes, chasing each other in front of a bright light like some form of ancient puppet play on a large canvas. Small forms were hunting big ones, only to then run into more of themselves, quickly starting a fight. They were pouncing and rolling with each other, no side seeming to win at any point as they hit and bit and punched and lunged, always seemed to be evenly matched. Sheeta herself was a passive observer in her dream, only watching as the battle played out. The figures were sometimes vaguer and sometimes sharper, but never really recognizable, always remaining just vague enough to not be understood as they drifted in and out of focus. Then, after a while, they stopped becoming sharper and just gradually turned hazier and hazier. At first she thought they were just getting out of focus again, but then she noticed that it wasn't the forms themselves that were getting less clear over time. Instead, something was starting to put a damper on her vision. Like a veil or a mist or... smoke. Yes, smoke. Now it was clear to her. Smoke was fogging her vision, slowly taking away the sight of the tiny, fighting puppets more and more as it got thicker and thicker over time. At first it was just a thin veil, but soon she could barely see through it anymore. It was just a dream, of course, but at that point she felt like she could almost smell it. Wait, a dream? A dream? But if she was dreaming, that meant she was asleep? Sheeda lurched up in bed, the realization of being asleep jolting her awake violently. Yet almost as soon as she had sat up, she already had to bend over again, as her body was wrecked by heavy coughs. Her diaphragm was spasming like it was trying to forcefully expel her lungs from her body. And she couldn't even blame it. Her entire airways felt like they were on fire. And that may not have even been too far off. It was far too dark to see the smoke, but Sheeda could smell it. It was intense, fogging up her senses with its wretched stench. Whatever was burning, she was pretty sure she wasn't supposed to breathe its remnants, judging by the smell alone. Acting on autopilot, she reached out next to her, grabbing onto James firmly before deliberately throwing herself off the bed and to the floor. Though her boyfriend had a good bit more mass than her, he wasn't putting up any fight as he lay there, allowing her to pull him down with her, as both of their bodies inelegantly crashed onto the hard ground, their fall not at all softened by the thin, velvety layer of fabric that was spanned over the hardwood underneath. The impact forced the air out to Sheeda's lungs, and her reflexive inhale right after only caused her to fall into another spasmic fit of coughing, although thankfully the air further down was marginally more breathable than what she had gotten up on the bed, allowing her to recover relatively quickly. Though already sweat started to drip from her forehead. It was warm in here. Too warm. The smoke carried the heat of the fire that had produced it, with it, as it squeezed into the room through the door. Sheeda's heart beat a mile a minute as she saw hints of flickering light come through the tiniest slits in the door. How had it gotten this intense already? Where was the alarm? The sprinklers? Anything? Did they still have a way out? Next to her, James now also groaned after her rude awakening, and after not even a moment, he too immediately began to cough. Clearly entirely disoriented, he began to twist and squirm around, his brain desperately looking for anything to orient itself by. Quickly, Sheeda reached out, managing to grab his hand by following just the sound of it, squeezing it firmly. "Treasure?" James asked between coughs, immediately recognizing the feeling, though his voice indicated that he was still very much delirious to a degree. "What's going on?" "There's a fire, I think," Sheeda replied intensely, doing her best to cover her nose with the meager clothes she was wearing for her sleep. "We've got to get out." James coughed heavily again, though it seemed that he was slowly becoming truly aware of the situation. "A fire?" he asked, his voice bordering on panic from the situation he had so suddenly been thrown into. And if Sheeda was being honest, she certainly felt that too. "But how?" Sheeda shook her head, trying her best to fight down the impulse to constantly cough her lungs out, so she could focus instead. "I don't know, but we have to get out," she quickly said in a commanding tone, really hoping that would be enough to make James's tired brain stop questioning things and spring into action instead. In the meantime, she was already trying to make a plan for what to do next here, before they would have no more time to think. The air close to the floor was still relatively breathable, at least inside of their room, but who knew when that would change? And who knew what the situation looked like on the outside? Maybe the hall was a bad idea. Should they go through the window? No. Even in this gravity, they were much too high to survive that, and the hotel didn't really have much in terms of climbable structures. Fire stairs were a distant dream that had apparently not been deemed necessary with the building's usual fire protection, which seemed to be mysteriously absent right now. Then maybe the bathroom? They could turn on the shower and sit the fire out under a protective layer of running water. No, that also wasn't an option. The smoke in here was already so thick, by the time the fire would burn itself out, it would have eaten up all the oxygen long before they were out of the woods, even if they tried their best to block every crack and slide in the doors. Judging by the amount of smoke that was already around, the air circulation system had either stopped or was already filled to the brim itself. In the meantime, James had started to move. Slowly he had crawled up to the door and was now carefully holding out his mechanical hand towards it, seemingly checking how much it had heated up. Though he soon pressed his entire palm against it, indicating it was not yet too hot to handle, which also indicated that the fire likely wasn't quite raging right outside it yet. Maybe it would still be safe to open. Sheeda knew James was more than smart enough to know that simply opening a door willy-nilly during a big fire could very quickly lead to disaster, and so she trusted that he had thoroughly investigated the situation at the door when he reached out for the controls to unlock and open it. No reaction. The door didn't budge. The panel wasn't broken. It reacted to James, and it even showed the typical door unlock screen after he went through the motions. However, the door itself didn't move an inch. Had the hydraulics been fried? No. No way. Those things were rated to insane temperatures these days. She'd remembered the declarations of conformity she had read for every single part of the GES back in the day, and she couldn't imagine the specifications of doors in a hotel were held to a so much lower standard. Besides, the panel would have to know if the door was broken and show some sort of error message instead of unlocked. James tried a few more times before slamming his mechanical hand into the wall, right next to the panel, leaving a deep indent, that however abruptly stopped on a much harder layer a few centimeters underneath the outer cover. "It's not working," he unhelpfully informed, though it was probably more of an outcry and frustration. Soon enough, he had to cower down yet again from yet another coughing fit, after he had lifted his head above the relatively smokeless layer for a bit too long, while he stood up. Realizing that the alarms were still not going off, and that she had only woken up through basically sheer luck, She'd quickly dashed over to their nightstand, holding her breath, as she stood up to grab both her and James's phone off of it quickly. Using both devices in tandem, she quickly called every phone of her surrounding contacts, hoping that the ringing would be enough to get everyone to their feet, should they not have woken up yet. Sheeda's heart beat all the way up into her ears, as she anxiously watched as the calls tried to build a connection. In the meantime, she could see how James removed his attention from the panel, and instead began to try to work on the door itself. By now she knew that, if this was a human invention, it would have had some sort of physical release, some mechanical part that could not be influenced from anywhere but in the room itself, that would allow the door to be opened almost no matter what. But with Quavery architecture she wasn't so sure, and trying to lift or otherwise open it also seemed entirely pointless. Suddenly, there was a mild click as one of the calls was picked up. It was the one she made from James's phone. "James!" Nia's frightened voice came from the line, sounding like she was just short of falling into an absolute panic. "James, the doors are stuck. We can't get out." "It's the same here," Sheeda replied, revealing that it was actually her who had made the call. "Try to stay calm, we'll figure something out." She simply had to say that, not just for Nia but also for herself. If she allowed herself for even a moment to really think that she was stuck, she knew she would lose all her focus at an instant. Still, seeing James vainly try everything in his power to move the door wasn't exactly something that brought much hope. There was some rumbling from the other side of the line, and Nia suddenly yelled out, "Don't!" she ordered loudly, her voice now away from the microphone, as she most likely talked to Tuya. "You need to keep your head down, and don't move too much." "Well, we have to do something!" Tuya's faint voice could be heard from further in the background. Almost as if on cue, there were suddenly 3 ear-piercing bangs, so loud that they seemed to shake the entire floor, causing Sheeda and James to flinch, and Nia to loudly scream out in surprise on the other end of the line. It seemed like someone had tried a more violent method to get the doors open, though if it worked would remain to be seen. Then again, what it did seem to have accomplished was to push Nia over the edge completely, as Sheeda could hear almost painful-sounding forceful inhales coming from the other end of the line, and they sounded anything but controlled. "Nia!" Sheeda yelled out almost synchronously with a second voice on the other end, and quick footsteps indicated that Tuya had stopped whatever attempt she was making to hurry over to her girlfriend instead. Shutting her mouth and listening, Sheeda could hear the lieutenant's comforting voice come through quietly, after the phone had seemingly been dropped. "It's alright, babe. We'll get out of here. Just look at me, alright?" Meanwhile, Sheeda's own earlier outcry seemed to have also jostled James out of his seemingly useless attempts to open the door, by force, as he quickly came running over, concern for his sister now written all over his face, as he crouched into the light of the phone screens. Though just because he stopped didn't mean everyone had given up. Even if there weren't any more shots being fired for now, the clear sounds of attempts to violently break the doors down were coming from multiple directions, indicating that more than one of the rooms had chosen violence as their way to try and get out. Sheeda couldn't blame them. As it seemed, this place was a damned death trap, Then the second call was picked up, this time coming through Sheeta's own phone. Almost immediately after beginning to speak, Moore's voice was already interrupted by deep, heavy coughs that sounded especially concerning coming from the fragile old lady.
Sheeta?
Not you too, Sheeta immediately mumbled as she heard the Raphaelite's voice. She bit her lip heavily, trying to keep herself in check. By now, her brain was also screaming that she should simply throw herself against the door until it would finally make way for her, and only a spark of rationality that remained for her kept her from wasting her entire energy reserves doing just that. Though a loud bang in the background of Moore's side of the conversation indicated that a certain large lizard had a different idea of rationality. Then again, maybe he would actually manage to break through. Hopefully he would.
You are stuck here as well?
Moore asked, whenever she could stop coughing for long enough to get the words out. Her voice sounded dry and brittle, and basically anything but healthy, even whenever she could string more than a few syllables together without needing to pause for yet another fit. We'll be fine, Sheeta immediately said, not even thinking for a moment about worrying the old lady, even for a second in the current situation. Just focus on yourself. Can you get out? There was a long pause on Moore's side that was only eventually interrupted by even more dry coughing. When she spoke up again, it seemed Moore had taken that break not by choice, but simply because of a need to take a few moments to try and breathe.
Conglodge is trying his best, but I'm not sure how much longer he can keep that up,
she explained. And although she left that part unsaid, it was clear that she was just as unsure of how long she would manage to last for under these conditions. Sheeta's eyes went wide and she could feel herself trembling, while her brain ran as hot as the fire outside trying to think of a way out. At this point, she was fully ready to take her chances with the window, just to try and get a shot at helping everyone else get out of this. However, before she could put that insane idea into action, James's phone was suddenly snatched out of her hand. Everything will be fine, I promise, he said into the line that was still connected to his sister, before hanging up. His face no longer showed any hint of panic, concern, or fear. Instead, it had turned to complete stone, apart from his eyes. No. His eyes were burning like fire, hotter than the inferno outside. Sheeta had only seen them once like that, back when she had gotten the scars on the right side of her face. It was like looking at a volcano moments before eruption. Quickly, he put in another number, and Sheeta stood her ears up straight to try and listen to what would be coming through that line now. Although her heart beating in her ears like a drum certainly didn't make that any easier. It didn't even take a moment after he called, and the call was already picked up. "Veselon, I need you right now," James yelled into the phone. Sheeta's eyes widened a bit at the mention of the name.
"James, what?"
The answer of the realized came out of the speakers, as she tried to understand what the human was trying to tell her.
"What do you—"
"Now, Veselon!" James yelled into the phone, before seemingly realizing that he would have to explain at least a little bit. "The hotel we're in is on fire. All the systems have been sabotaged. That's the only reason I can think of. I need you to reactivate them." Veselon didn't miss a beat before she replied, "James, I can't just—" "There's no time!" James interrupted her immediately, his face hardening even further. And still, despite the darkness, Sheeta was sure she could see a tear start to run down his stony cheek. "I am aware of the risks and how many laws it breaks. I am willing to take the full responsibility, but I need those systems running now."
"James, that's—"
Veselon tried once more, but James just released a frustrated groan. "Lives are on the line, Veselon," he screamed out, though it sounded less like he was screaming at her, and more like he was just venting his sorrow to the world. His eyes moistened even further at his expression, remaining unmoved. "I understand that you are scared, but if you don't do this, everyone here will die. I took a gamble in trusting you, so show me that you have a fucking conscience." There was a moment of pause, a long moment of pause, and the whole world seemed to fall silent. "Veselon?" James asked quietly into the phone. As there was still no answer, he repeated it, yelling the name out as his voice broke. "Veselon!" A click indicated that the connection had been cut. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze, and Sheeta could tell with one look into James's eyes that he was fractions of a second from breaking. And then, she felt a first, thick drop of water falling onto her face.